this space. These are the journalisms by way of critical aggregation, illuminated from the analytical research of a historiographer, neither from the Oriental nor the Occidental. Your engagement, through a like, a share, and a subscribe, will accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before.
Engage impulse engines. Engage. Engage.
Engage.
Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Engage.
Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage. Engage.
Captain.
Engage emergency override.
Engage. Engage. Engage.
Engage forward shields, 35%.
Engage.
Engage the cloaking device.
Engage.
Of them. Engage them in conversation.
Engage. Engage.
Syria condemns U.S. general visit. Watch this space. And from the cradle.co, Syria condemns illegal visit of top U.S. general. The U.S. military steals 80% of daily Syrian oil output, inflicting damages of up to $107 billion since the start of the war in 2011. The Syrian Foreign Ministry on 5 March strongly condemned the illegal visit of the U.S. Army General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, to an undisclosed base in Syria's northeast a day earlier. The Foreign Ministry stressed that the visit is a flagrant violation of Syria's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and unity. A source at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Expatriates said, Syria strongly condemns the illegal visit of the U.S. Chief of Staff to an illegal U.S. military base in northeastern Syria and affirms that it's a flagrant violation of the sovereignty, the sanctity of its lands, and unity, according to RT. Syria calls on the U.S. administration to immediately stop its systematic and continuous violations of international law and stops its support for separatist armed militias, and Syria affirms that these U.S. practices will not deviate it from its approach to combating terrorism and preserving its sovereignty, security, and stability, the source added. The top U.S. general visited Syria on Saturday allegedly to assess efforts to prevent a resurgence of ISIS and to review safeguards for U.S. forces against attacks, including from drones flown by Iran-backed militias, Reuters reported. Some 1,000 American troops continue to support allied Arab and Kurdish militias from the Syrian Democratic Forces in the region, according to Al Monitor. Milley's visit to Syria signals the Biden administration's seriousness about keeping troops in the country in support of the SDF. The visit happened shortly after U.S. Representative Matt Gaetz introduced legislation to end the U.S. occupation of Syria, saying, Congress has never authorized the use of military force in Syria, adding, the U.S. is currently not in a war with or against Syria, so why are we conducting dangerous military operations there? The official reason for the U.S. to remain in Syria and fight ISIS is also questioned by government officials, who claim that the U.S. military is supporting ISIS and using the presence of the armed group as a pretext for maintaining its occupation and looting Syrian oil, along with other valuable resources. According to eyewitness reports from the countryside of Urubia in the Hasaka Governorate, on 27 February, U.S. troops transported at least 34 tankers filled with stolen Syrian oil through the illegal Mahmoudiya border, crossing to their bases in Iraq. In August of last year, the Syrian Ministry of Foreign Affairs said that losses incurred by the country's oil and gas sector as a result of U.S. actions amounted to $107 billion since the beginning of the Syrian crisis. And from Al Monitor, top U.S. General Mark Milley makes surprise visit to Syria. General Mark Milley's visit to U.S. troops fighting the Islamic State came as Pentagon officials warn Russia's arms transfers to Iran will embolden the IRGC and its proxies in the Middle East. Top U.S. General Mark Milley made a surprise visit on Saturday to Syria, where fewer than 1,000 American troops continue to support local militia forces combating the remnants of the Islamic State group. Milley, who serves as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and is ending his term in September, met with the commander of the U.S.-led coalition to defeat IS, the Islamic State, Army Major General Matthew McFarland, and reviewed secretary measures from an undisclosed base in Syria's northeast. The arrival of Washington's top general to Syria signals the Biden administration's seriousness about keeping troops in the country in support of the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces. From Voice of America, Syria condemns U.S. top general's visit to Kurdish-held northeast. Syria's foreign ministry Sunday condemned a surprise visit by the United States top military officer to an army base in the Kurdish-held northeast, dubbing it a legal state media. In his snap visit Saturday, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Mark Milley met U.S. troops stationed in areas of war-torn Syria under the control of the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces. About 900 U.S. troops are deployed in several bases and posts across northeastern Syria as part of the fight against Islamic State group remnants. The official news agency SANA quoted a foreign ministry official as saying, "Syria strongly condemns the illegal visit of the American chairman of the Chiefs of Staff to an illegal American military base in northeast Syria. Milley's visit was a flagrant violation of the sovereignty and integrity of Syrian territory," the official added, according to SANA, calling on the U.S. administration to immediately cease its systematic and continued violation of international law and support for separatist armed groups. President Bashar al-Assad's government views the deployment of U.S. forces in SDF-held territory as occupation and accuses U.S.-aligned Kurdish forces of separatist tendencies. Kurdish officials deny any separate or separatist aspirations and say they seek to preserve their self-rule, which Damascus does not recognize. Milley spokesperson Colonel David Butler told AFP the U.S. general visited northeast Syria Saturday to meet with commanders and troops. It was Milley's first trip to Syria since assuming the chairmanship in 2019. He visited the country before as an army chief, the spokesperson said. And during the visit, Milley received updates on the counter-ISIS mission, Butler added using an alternative acronym for the IS jihadis. The general also inspected force protection measures and asserted repatriation efforts for the Al-Hol refugee camp, home to more than 50,000 people, including family members of suspected foreign IS militants whose home countries have not taken them back. The U.S.-led coalition battling IS provides support for SDF, spearheaded by the Syrian Kurdish People's Protection Units, the YPG. After the jihadis lost their last territory to SDF-led forces in 2019, SDF has cracked down on remnants of IS, whose members still launch deadly attacks in Syria. U.S. forces have killed or arrested IS figures in numerous operations, including the group's leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi in 2019. On February 19th, the U.S. military said troops working with SDF captured an Islamic State provincial official. The raid came a day after 4 U.S. troops were wounded as they continued another raid to kill a senior IS group leader in northeastern Syria, the U.S. military Central Command said. And from media news, top U.S. general makes surprise visit to Syria's Kurdish-controlled northeast. U.S. support to northeastern Syria should continue in order to avoid the risk of growing terror threat, a top U.S. military official said when he unexpectedly visited U.S. troops in Syria's Kurdish-controlled northeast. And let's be clear, the U.S. is backing the people who are not part of the Syrian government. The U.S. is backing the Kurdish forces in the northeast and I guess you could call them Islamic State forces in the northwest, whose names are constantly changing as far as U.S. media is concerned to obfuscate the fact that they're being backed up by the United States. Army General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, visited a U.S. base in the region to evaluate the mission led by armed Kurdish groups against the Islamic State since 2014. The jihadist group has escalated its activities in northeastern Syria in recent months as the attacks of the Turkish military on Kurdish forces and drones flown by Iranian-backed militias have created a security vacuum. Reporters asked Milley whether the deployment of roughly 900 U.S. troops in northeast Syria was worth the risk, referring to the security of the United States and tying it to the situation in Syria. Milley said, "If you think that that's important, then the answer is yes," Reuters reported. "I think that an enduring defeat of ISIS and continuing to support our friends and allies in the region, I think those are important tasks that can be done," he said. This is propaganda, right? Yeah. And the same words are being scrolled here on the right, or on my right. Milley also told reporters traveling with him that he wanted to check on force protection because U.S. troops deployed in the region were exposed to indirect fire, North Press News Agency reported. "Unless you support and devote the correct amount of resources to it, things will get worse," the agency quoted the general as saying. "If the United States completely ignores the region, it will set the conditions for a resurgence of ISIS," said the general. And from Al Arabiya News, U.S. General Milley makes unannounced visit to Syria, reviews mission. The top U.S. military official made an unannounced visit to a U.S. base in Syria on Saturday to assess a nearly 8-year-old mission there to combat the ISIS terrorist group and to review safeguards for U.S. troops against attack. Army General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told reporters traveling with him that he believed U.S. troops and their Kurdish-led Syrian partners were making progress at ensuring a lasting defeat of ISIS. Asked if he believed the Syria mission was worth the risk, Milley tied it to the security of the United States and said, "If you think that's important, then the answer is yes." And from Press TV, here's a bit on Mark Milley and Syria.
It's news review time. Stay tuned to Press TV. Damascus has condemned a visit by the top U.S. general to an American base in northeast Syria. The Syrian Foreign Ministry says the visit is illegal and a flagrant violation of the country's sovereignty. On Saturday, the U.S. Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, made an unannounced visit to assess the nearly 8-year mission there. Washington has stationed force and equipment in northeast of Syria without the consent of Damascus. The Pentagon claims it's fighting Daesh terrorists there. Damascus says that the illegal deployment is tantamount to occupation and aimed at supporting terrorists and plundering Syria's natural resources. Former U.S. President Donald Trump admitted on several occasions American forces were in the Arab country for its oil wealth. Let me invite a couple of guests to see what's going on there. So our correspondent Mohammed Ali is joining me From Damascus, the Syrian capital, Ken Stone, who is with the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, is also joining me from Hamilton. Good to see you, gentlemen. So, Mohammed, beginning with you, tell us how the Damascus government and the Syrian people feel about this. The U.S. is not asked to go to Syria to, as they allege, try to fight Daesh terrorists. They admitted themselves that they were the people who created terrorist groups like Daesh and gave rise to them. So what are they doing there? Tell us about the reactions both on the part of the government and the people in Syria.
Yes, exactly. What the U.S. is doing in Syria, it's occupying Syria, it's supporting terrorism, and it's going after its own interests and, of course, killing Syrian people. Now, the Syrian Foreign Ministry strongly condemned the visit of the U.S. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to northeast of Syria. This is an illegal visit, according to the Foreign Ministry, to an illegal U.S. base in the country under the pretext of evaluating the U.S. fight against Daesh. Now, the Foreign Ministry said that such claims are false and that the international community, the entire international community, knows that Daesh was made by U.S. intelligence, explaining further the statement of the Foreign Ministry that Daesh never attacked any U.S. base in Syria or any U.S. troops on Syrian soil, only attacked Syrian civilians, innocent civilians. The Foreign Ministry in a statement also said that the U.S. continues to provide support to terrorist groups in Syria and also to separatist militias, referring, of course, to the so-called Syria's democratic forces on the ground, with the aim of prolonging the terrorist war on Syria. The Foreign Ministry demanded the U.S. to stop its violations of Syria's sovereignty over here, and also called on the international community to condemn such actions by the U.S. And finally, the Foreign Ministry concluded by saying that such acts and actions by the United States will not prevent Syria from fighting terrorism and preserving its sovereignty, security, and stability. If you ask the Syrian people on the ground, of course, they reject such presence. This presence has led to looting Syria's resources, preventing Syrians from getting their oil, which led to high prices. This presence led, and intervention by the U.S. led to the killing of civilians and destruction of Syria's infrastructure by the U.S.-led coalition.
Okay. All right, Ken Stone, you just heard Mohammed Ali talk about how the Syrians feel about U.S. boots on Syrian soil. So General Mark Milley going there, is he going there to see, I don't know, to maybe find better ways to secure the oil that American forces are trying to get out, to smuggle out of Syria, or what? I mean, why should the U.S. be somewhere where they are not wanted, they are not asked for to do anything? What are they doing there?
The U.S. has two purposes in occupying the eastern third of Syria, completely illegally, of course. One purpose is to deny Syria the ability to undertake reconstruction, because the U.S. is plundering the oil and wheat resources so that Syria doesn't have the money to reconstruct itself after 12 long years of failed U.S. regime change war, which was supported by the U.S. allies, such as, unfortunately, Canada. That's reason one. Reason two is the U.S. officials have openly stated that they're occupying the eastern third of Syria in order to use that occupation as a bargaining chip in the final settlement over the end of the U.S. proxy war in Syria. So the U.S. is in there illegally. They know they're in there illegally, but they're staying there because they're using it for a foreign policy goal. And it just shows the utter hypocrisy of the U.S. In condemning Russia for its military presence in Ukraine, while at the same time they're occupying the eastern third of Syria. And we know that the U.S., that the Russians are in Ukraine because the U.S. and NATO provoked them into being into a war in which NATO expanded 800 kilometers eastward, despite a promise made in 1991 to Mr. Gorbachev, and they have provoked the war with Russia because they have pushed their expansion right to the gates of Moscow. So the U.S. is an aggressive empire. It is waging wars around the world or destabilizing countries from Syria to Ukraine to Taiwan to Cuba because the U.S. has one thing in mind, and that is hegemony. In other words, it seeks to dominate the planet.
Okay, Ken. What price should the U.S. keep, staying as a hegemon, and that on the other side of the planet, and see what the fate of the American presence was in Afghanistan after 20 years, and also in Iraq? They want him out. So how long will they be staying in Syria?
I don't have a timetable, but I can tell you that this occupation is temporary. Our coalition, the Hamilton Coalition to Stop the War, recently had a webinar called Connecting the Dots, which people can access if they go on our website. And we show how the U.S. empire is desperately trying to hang on to the status of being the sole superpower in a unipolar world, which it was from about the end of the Soviet Union, 1990, 1991, until about 2015, when the Russian army intervened to prevent the U.S. from establishing a no-fly zone over Syria in the same way that they established a no-fly zone over Libya. So I think the game is changing, the balance of power in the world has changed, and it's only a matter of time until the U.S. is forced out of the eastern third of Syria.
Okay, thank you so much. Mohammed Ali in Damascus, Syria, Ken Stone in Hamilton, Ontario. Thank you for watching this episode of the News Review.
And from Mondoweiss, rising resistance in Jenin and lawfare in the United States. On January 26th, the Israeli army conducted a deadly invasion of the Jenin refugee camp in the occupied West Bank. In the span of a few hours, the army shot and killed 9 Palestinians. This is from Mondoweiss. A 10th Palestinian died a few days later from injuries sustained during the raid. It was one of the deadliest single invasions in the Jenin camp and in the West Bank in years. It came on the heels of a year-long effort by the Israeli military to quash the resurgence of Palestinian armed resistance. And the Jenin refugee camp has a long history of armed resistance to Israel's occupation. Yuna, a person featured in a podcast we're about to play, traveled to Jenin days after the deadly raid to speak to the people and hear about what they experienced. And then back to the United States. In 2019, the Jewish National Fund and a group of American Israelis sued the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights over its support for nonviolent BDS movement. The U.S. campaign is a fiscal sponsor of the Boycott National Committee, which has ties to various groups in Palestine. According to the lawsuit, some of these groups are terrorist organizations responsible for firebomb attacks on land owned by the Jewish National Fund in Israel. Activities say this is simply the latest attempt to suppress human rights work. And earlier this month, Diala Shamas, a lawyer at the Center for Constitutional Rights and one of the attorneys representing the U.S. campaign, told The Guardian, the goal is here to harass the U.S. campaign for Palestinian rights in places like Jenin and all over Palestine. This is something that we're seeing more broadly, smearing human rights advocates with accusations of terrorism and efforts to drag human rights advocates and protesters into court. into extended litigation that distracts them from their advocacy. And here's a clip from Rising Resistance in Jenin and lawfare in the United States.
Killed, what happened, the damages that were sustained by the civilian population in the camp and the neighbors who live around this home of the wanted fighters that were targeted. But also we were there really to get an understanding of the history of the camp and how that has influenced what we're seeing today, which is a rise and a resurgence of armed resistance groups that we have not seen since the Second Intifada.
Mm. And describe for people what it's like in these camps. When you say
Palestinian refugees, now you're talking about the fourth, even fifth generation of refugees have been living in these refugee camps. At the beginning, back in 1948 and the 1950s, these camps were very much what you would typically think of a refugee camp. So tents and sort of these non-permanent structures. But because the Palestinian refugee issue is very much an enduring issue that has lasted for 75 years now, the tents eventually became permanent structures, which eventually became multi-story homes and buildings. And so Palestinian refugee camps are extremely overcrowded. They lack basic and proper infrastructure. The people who live there tend to be amongst the poorest populations within Palestinian society, again, because of the economic losses that they sustained during the Nakba that have continued to perpetuate their families and their communities for generations. And so these are some of the most overcrowded, underfunded, underserviced, and poorest areas in Palestine. So that's not just the Jenin refugee camp, it's Palestinian refugee camps across the occupied Palestinian territory and the diaspora. But that sort of gives you an idea of what these camps look like. So the Jenin refugee camp is around 16,000 people living in an area roughly of around half a square kilometer. And so, like other refugee camps, it's quite overcrowded. A lot of the homes are very close to one another. People are kind of piled on top of each other. And so what happened during the raid is the army targeted one specific home that these fighters were allegedly holed up in, these wanted fighters. And so the main sort of, let's say, the main part of the confrontations and the fiercest part of the confrontations happened around this house. You know, Israeli troops used snipers, guns, rocket launchers, and all sorts of weapons directed at this house and the civilian homes around it. So this house was essentially the house that the fighters were in that belonged to the ZOG family in the Jenin camp was essentially completely destroyed and bombed out. But it also affected all the homes around it. So we visited some of the neighbors and some of the people who lived around that home. Their ceilings and their rooftops were crumbling on top of them because of the sheer force that their homes took in when these rockets and other explosive devices were fired by the Israeli forces towards the ZOG family home. We actually met a woman who you'll be able to see in the video. We interviewed her. The Israeli forces raided her family's home. They ransacked the house. They positioned snipers across the house and on the rooftop. And they actually used this lady's kitchen, her kitchen window, as the launching point for the rocket launchers to fire towards the ZOG family home. So her home just sustained lots of damage, as did many of the other homes around her.
And there's actually footage from the IDF of them firing the rocket launchers from the woman's kitchen.
Yeah, absolutely. And we also include that. So we have this sort of parallel in the video where we show the perspective of this woman and her family and the damage that was done to their home, and also the perspective of the Israeli army and their cameras that they used to also record the raid, which again, they regarded as a very successful quote, anti-terrorism operation.
In the report, you interview on camera a member of an armed resistance group. What was the process like to get that interview? What group did he belong to?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the person we interviewed, he was part of a newer armed group in the camp called the Jenin Brigades, or in some translations, it's been translated to the Jenin Battalion. Okay. The Jenin Brigade was formed in 2021 by armed fighters affiliated with the Palestinian Islamic Jihad movement. What the Jenin Brigade has done, and this is very much tied to the nature of the camp that they live in, and the fact that there has always been this sort of cross-factional cooperation within the Jenin refugee camp when it comes to resisting Israeli invasions into their camp, as we saw in the Second Intifada and also most recently. And so while the Jenin Brigade was started by fighters affiliated with the Islamic Jihad movement, they have since sort of developed, or in practice, come to sort of include fighters from across different factions. So Fatah, Hamas, PFLP, other factions in the camp that fight together alongside one another under sort of this branch of the Jenin Brigade. Again, it is primarily affiliated with the Islamic Jihad movement, but it does encompass other factions, and they also do fight alongside the armed wings of other factions in the camp. And so this fighter that we met, he was a young guy. I would place him in his early 20s, and that's sort of the demographic primarily of a lot of these groups. And you're seeing this sort of a younger generation of fighters come up inside this camp and also across Palestine. So we were really lucky to be able to meet with him. So just to give you a little bit of an insight into the process, you asked sort of what it was like to try to get that interview. We had a local fixer with us who essentially in the lead up, as soon as we contacted him the day before, so right after this raid happened, he was sort of working tirelessly to get in touch with these fighters who he has built contact with over the course of many years. And it was essentially just a waiting game. So communicating with them or finding ways to communicate with them, and sort of this back and forth until we eventually got an answer. And so our fixer was working for, close to 2 days on this. When we were actually there, we spent most of the morning and afternoon filming our interviews and footage with other people in the camp. And then by the evening, we were pretty much just done and waiting to talk to this fighter. And so it was several hours of just waiting. So phone calls back and forth and there was kind of an effect over his voice, essentially, so to not reveal his identity. So that was also part of the conditions in which we were allowed to interview him.
Yeah, we almost never hear directly from.
While in recent years, we've seen that start to change. Palestinians are starting to get maybe more airtime or more of a platform on in certain media outlets, although there's very much is still an imbalance. But one sector of the population that is still very much not heard from, but is frequently talked about, are these armed fighters. We see images of, in the West, we're constantly inundated with the images of, the quintessential Palestinian terrorist, right? Mm-hmm. The masked gunmen. We see their images. We hear Israeli military and security officials and political leaders talking about them. We see political pundits from, all around the world talking about these Palestinians and these Palestinian terror groups and whatnot. But we never actually hear from those fighters themselves. And it's also even within Palestine, Palestinian media and Arabic media, Arabic language media, it's not very common for people to actually interview these fighters. The fighters in Jenin have given some access just over the past year to more media outlets to interview them. So we're not the first, but it is still very rare for people to hear from these fighters. And so clearly these fighters, these armed groups, as you know, especially in the past couple months and the past year, are playing a huge role and an increasingly important role in the current sort of political landscape on the ground in Palestine.
Here's an interview from a Jenin fighter, a clip from an interview of a Jenin fighter that this Mondoweiss reporter is referring to.
شاب زي عز وكمان شباب في جيله عم بيروحوا أكثر
محاصرين جميع النواحي ممنوع نسافر ممنوع نروح ممنوع نيجي.
So she asked, what do you think of, let's see.
Fighters. 4 of them were in their 20s. Ammar's younger brother, Azzeddin, was one of them.
Why do you think a young man like Izzeddin, a brother, and other young men in his generation are moving towards armed resistance? We are surrounded on all sides, Ammar Salahat says. We can't travel or move about freely. The youth are under pressure. We're under pressure from all sides. Someone's dad is a martyr, or his brother, or his uncle. When they grow up, they want to be like their uncle or their brother. When you turn on the news, it's all about Jenin. People need to do something. Enough of the negotiations. Those negotiations have brought us nothing. Since I was born, I've been hearing about negotiations, and it's all been for nothing. That was a clip. We'll continue with a bit more of the podcast.
Their actions, what they're doing, what they're preaching is part of the conversation. And so we wanted to talk to them and we wanted to hear it directly from them, sort of, you know, who are you? What is motivating you? And, you know, what is your message to people? You know, we wanted to hear it from them. And so one of the first questions that I asked this young man, and he was a young man, one of the questions I asked him was, you know, Israel and the rest of the world says that you are a terrorist and that you belong to a terrorist organization. And that when the army comes in to conduct these raids, they are doing it in the name of counterterrorism operations and quote unquote saving Israeli lives. And so I asked him that. I said, you know, this is sort of how you're portrayed. What do you say to that? What do you think about that? And he acknowledged, of course, that they're aware of the fact that they are portrayed and sort of labeled as terrorists. He said, we know that this is who people think we are. We know people say that we're terrorists. But this label of, you know, violent terrorists who just want to kill Israelis for no reason because they, you know, are maybe anti-Semites and hate Jews. He said, that's not the case. He said, we are not terrorists and we do not even acknowledge that sort of name that's been given to us because it's a name that was given to us by the occupier and by this state and colonial power that has been occupying us for the past 75 years. He said, so I don't even acknowledge that designation. And he said, we are not terrorists. The real terrorists are the Israeli army and the Israeli occupation who are coming into our camps, coming into our streets, coming into our homes on a nightly basis and killing our people. And he said that the world needs to know that we are not the terrorists, Israel is. And when I asked him sort of, what drives you and other young men like you to choosing this path? Because it's a path that most surely will either end in your death or your imprisonment. And he said, you know, we chose this path because of what I saw in my life. He said it was part of my personal convictions. And I made this decision because of everything that I've experienced since I was a child. He said, from the time I was a child, we witnessed.
Yeah, here's the clip she was speaking
which
of.
has been inspired by the groups here inside the Jenin refugee camp.
The world must know that we are not terrorists, she says. As the Zionist occupation claims, we are fighters in the name of Allah. We came out of our mother's wombs to fight this occupier who has stolen. We came out of our mother's wombs.
Now they're part of a growing movement by the groups here in
came out of our mother's wombs into this world to fight this occupier who's stolen our religion, our customs, our traditions, who's killed our martyred fathers and our brothers. The world needs to know we aren't terrorists. The occupation is the only terrorist in this world.
Raids, killings, executions, the imprisonment of our families, the destruction of our homes, and all of this oppression that led us to this point.
In the last few days after you finished the filming for this piece, Israeli settlers and military personnel have carried out attacks on Palestinian communities across the West Bank. We've covered this on the site. The Palestinian town Hawara suffered deaths and widespread destruction of homes, vehicles, other personal property. Clearly, the hard-right Netanyahu government is determined to increase the violence being inflicted on Palestinians. What do you and our reporting team there in Palestine see coming in the days ahead?
It's hard to predict exactly how things are going to unfold, of course, but what we can say with certainty is that we are dealing with a right-wing fascist government in Israel that has control over the lives of millions of Palestinians that for the past 75 years have not had a say in this government or the policies that they put forward to control Palestinian lives and dispossess Palestinians from their land. You currently have some of the most extremist right-wing ultra-nationalist settlers who are criminals in their own right and have been accused and charged with terrorism because of their extremely racist and anti-Palestinian beliefs and ideologies. These settlers are now in the highest levels of the Israeli government. They're controlling policy, they control the police and the armed forces. They are the ones that are in control of how land is used in the West Bank. So that means more Palestinians' homes are being demolished, while in turn settlement expansion is being promoted. And so we're at this point that, this current government is not even trying to hide sort of what their goals are and what they're trying to do on the ground. As you mentioned, sort of what was happening in Hawara over the past couple days. After what happened in Hawara, you had members of this current Israeli government celebrating the pogroms that happened in Hawara and calling for the complete wiping out of this Palestinian city. And so what we've seen just over the past week and over the past few months is definitely an indication of things to come. I think the situation is going to continue to get worse. Settler violence that is backed and supported and promoted by the state is going to escalate. And at the same time, Palestinian resistance to that in many different forms is going to continue. The person that we interviewed in our Jenin video, there were a couple people that put it very clearly. They said, as long as there is oppression and as long as Palestinian people are deprived of their rights to freedom and dignity, there will always be resistance to that oppression and to that violence. So as long as there is no safety and security for the Palestinian people, there will also be no safety and security for the Israeli people or the people of the world as well. And so I think that we can expect more of what we've been seeing, especially now with Ramadan coming up this month. These sort of tensions and things that we've been seeing in the West Bank are surely to spill over into Jerusalem and the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. So I think we have a tumultuous few months ahead of us.
And this is Nori Shabibi, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, Nori Shabiba on Jenin.
Yeah, so, Ramallah is the hub of the Palestinian Authority. That's where they all hang out. Their security apparatus is like thriving there. U.S. diplomats will come through Ramallah, U.S. aid. That's the little bubble that's creating an issue for all of Palestine right now. It's the corruption that's occurring there. That corruption, that economic bubble, in my opinion, has manifested in a sentiment by the public that this is not sustainable, and not only that, it's extremely harmful. And so where you have places like Nablus, which is to the north, and Jenin, which is further north in the West Bank, we saw a mobilization that unified several groups, regardless, if they're of the religious wing or they're leftist. But we see a unification that, one, rejects this corruption and the role that the PA has played in allowing the Israeli army to invade. So the PA, the Palestinian Authority, will notify the Israelis if somebody's in a given location, come get him right here. They'll do that. They share intelligence. The standard of living, the people are really struggling right now. And so when you see this class of people in blacked out SUVs and nice villas and living the life and jet setting, and then you see the child in the refugee camp who's fighting for his dignity, this manifests in a generation of resistance. And I think it's very important for us to keep in mind that our resistance never ended. It might seem as though there were ups and downs, and that might be the case, but through and through, we have always resisted. And now I think things have manifested in a way to where the popular resistance is becoming so widespread that folks are becoming more activated. So in Jenin, I think those calls and those actions of resistance that really confronted not only settlers and their violence around Jenin, but also hit the core of the Zionist entity. That was deeply felt. The Israelis came to their knees, because several fighters went into their homeland. And that, I think, was an awakening for the Zionists to say, this is not, we're not secure here ultimately. They're still thinking about coming back to their land. And I think one of the Zionist early thinkers would always say their hope was that the youth would forget, that they'd let go of those lands. The Palestinian Authority in Oslo and that two-state solution was in the hopes people would forget the right of return. But nobody forgot. These youth, these 20-year-olds said, we're not forgetting. We're not going to die just, living on a meager wage and being under the boot of not only the Israeli occupation, but also under the boot of the Palestinian Authority. And they've simply had enough. And so when you have Jenin rise up and you see this beautiful intergenerational collaboration, it's not just youth. There were teachers who would help. One of the recent martyrs was a teacher, and he was trying to help one of those who were shot. And that, there was a doctor who was martyred in Jenin. And you see the different roles within our society, and to some extent different classes. You see women activated. You see this linkage back to the original root and cause of Palestinian liberation, and it's being taken back from the Palestinian Authority. They've maintained a monopoly over what Palestine should look like and what our demands should be and through what avenues. And there's been a concerted effort to denigrate armed resistance, and the people have had enough. When they're getting hit by Israelis and by the Palestinian Authority, they're like, what the heck? There's only so much we can take. And so Nablus becomes organized across different groups and unified. And you see mentorship occurring between older folks who lived through a first intifada or a second intifada, now talking to the youth about principles, about cause, about what it is we're doing, about not settling for the reality of the refugee camp as your ultimate future and end all, but that you have a right to return. And so we have these young leaders rise, and to hear the wisdom in their words. And it's said in such a colloquial way that every Palestinian would understand. It really now puts the Palestinian Authority under pressure, because everything they've been doing has been in complete contradiction to what the people want and what they demand and the means by which they demand.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
Or through boycott or whatever. And so with Nablus, it doesn't just end in Nablus. You see a mobilization also in Tulkarm, which is also in the north. You see a mobilization occurring in Al-Khalil in the south. We see a mobilization. We've seen days of violence in Ariha, in Jericho. Shu'afat in Al-Quds, in Jerusalem, the capital of Palestine, became mobilized. Not only that, was adamant about securing their fighters. And so the youth have taken on and resumed, in my opinion, the way I phrase it, the journey of our prior fighters and martyrs. This isn't anything new, but the suppression and the millions of dollars and the guns that were invested into the Israeli military and the Palestinian Authority have effectively failed in muting our youth and the future of the movement.
Oh my gosh. That's inspiring.
Yep, watch this space, and we'll be back with more news. Headtopics.com. China to ramp up military spending by 7.2%, eclipsing rate of economic growth. China to ramp up military spending by 7.2%. It's planning to surge its defense budget by that much, a higher rate of expansion than its 5% economic growth for 2023, or at least its objective for 2023. It's the national budget unveiled Sunday. China allocated 1.55 trillion won, 224 billion, to its military as geopolitical tensions with the West over the status of Taiwan and the South China Sea loom, the Associated Press reported. For comparison, the U.S. has authorized roughly $858 billion for the fiscal year of 2023, so that's about 4 times more. Trump commented, "I doubt that China is more dangerous than Iran. Our armed forces, with a focus on the goals for the centenary of the People's Liberation Army in 2027, should work to carry out military operations, boost combat preparedness, and enhance military capabilities," Premier Li Keqiang said, per the report. And from Asia News Network, Chinese government proposed a 7.2% rise in defense budget to $225 billion. China's planned defense spending for this year will reach 1.55 trillion won, or 224 billion a year-on-year increase of 7.2%, according to a draft budget report submitted to the annual session of China's top legislature on Sunday morning. The draft budget report, which was prepared for the Ministry of Finance, was deliberated on at the opening meeting of the first session of the 14th National People's Congress in Beijing. If approved by lawmakers, the proposed defense budget will maintain single-digit growth for will maintain single-digit growth for it will maintain single-digit growth for the 8th consecutive year. At the NPC session last year, a defense budget of 1.5 trillion won was proposed, up 7.1% year-on-year. A defense budget of 1.45 trillion won, up 7.1%. And the figure for 2021 was 1.35 trillion won, up 6.8%. The annual government work report delivered at Sunday's opening meeting of the 14th NPC session said that China's national defense and military development have made remarkable achievements over the past year, and the military has effectively safeguarded national sovereignty, security, and interests. The work report noted that the military would continue to make all efforts to implement Xi Jinping thought on the strengthening the military and the party's military strategies in the new era, focus on the goals that the People's Liberation Army needs to accomplish by centenary in 2027, and fulfill tasks given by the party and the people. Speaking at a news conference in Beijing on Saturday, Wang Qiao, the spokesman for the first session of the 14th NPC, said that China's defense budget increase is appropriate and reasonable. The increase in defense spending is needed for meeting the complex security challenges and for China to fulfill its responsibilities as a major country. China's defense spending as a share of GDP has stayed basically stable for many years and is lower than the world average, he said. The country's defense spending is determined based on the overall consideration of the need for its defense building and economic development levels, which is common practice around the world, Wang added. China's future is closely intertwined with that of the entire world. China's military modernization will not be a threat to any other country. On the contrary, it'll only be positive for safeguarding regional stability and world peace, he said. Song Zongping, a military affairs commentator and retired officer of the PLA, said that China's maintained a moderate increase in its defense expenditure for many years, and the nation doesn't seek to get involved in arms races with other countries. Despite the fact that the U.S., some European countries, and Japan have tremendously hiked their military budgets, China's refrained from sharply raising its own budget, though it's fully capable of doing so, Song said. Our country's not like this or the US and Japan that keep going after military superiority. That's not what we want. China wants a balance in economic development and defense capabilities. The world's largest spender on military affairs in the US is the US. Its defense budget for the year was $858 billion, a year-on-year increase of 11.7%. A large proportion in the military bill will go to Ukraine and China's Taiwan region to strengthen their armed forces, U.S. media reported. In Japan, a record defense budget of 6.8 trillion yen for this year was recently approved by lawmakers, highlighting an astonishing 26% annual increase. And from India Today, China hikes defense budget for 8th consecutive year with 7.2% increase, 3 times higher than India. China on Sunday hiked its defense budget by 7.2%, marginally higher than last year. China last year pegged its defense budget at 1.45 trillion. That was 7.1%, an increase of 7.1%. However, in view of the appreciation of the dollar against the yuan, this year's defense spending of China totaled, according to the state-run China Daily, about 225 billion. Last year, in dollar terms, China's defense spending amounted to 230 billion. So it's actually, counting the exchange rate, it's actually less. Relative to the U.S. This is for the 8th consecutive year that China has announced a single-digit percentage point increase in its military budget. In his work report presented to the opening session of the National People's Congress, the country's rubber-stamp parliament outgoing Premier Li Keqiang spoke highly of the armed forces' achievements at the borders without directly referring to the Eastern Ladakh standoff. They carried out operations in a firm and flexible way, and they effectively conducted major missions relating to border defense, to maritime protection, to counterterrorism and stability maintenance, to disaster rescue, and to relief, to COVID-19 response, peacekeeping, merchant ship escorting. All of these things Lee's work report said. The reference to major missions relating to border defense was regarded as significant in the context of offensive actions by the PLA in eastern Ladakh in May 2020 along the line of actual control with India, triggering a prolonged standoff, virtually freezing the relations between the two countries. Both sides held 17 rounds of high-level military talks to resolve the standoff, and the 18th round was expected to take place soon. China is the second biggest spender on defense next to the U.S., whose defense budget for 2023 was $816 billion. From India's point of view, however, China's defense budget continued to be over 3 times higher. India's defense budget for 2023-24 amounted to around $72.6 billion. Aided by increasing defense budgets, the 2 million strong People's Liberation Army, the world's largest military, is increasingly getting powerful and assertive with the ever-expanding military modernization of its army, navy, and air force. The Chinese military is headed by President Xi Jinping, who's the chairman of the powerful Central Military Commission, the overall high command of the PLA. Xi, 69, the only Chinese leader to have been elected for an unprecedented third 5-year term by the ruling Communist Party, CPC, in October last year, also heads the party besides the presidency. Under his leadership, the Chinese military has embarked on a massive military modernization with a goal to be on par with the U.S. Armed Forces in the next few years. The Chinese Navy, the fast expanding arm of the Chinese military, has now 3 aircraft carriers, while its Air Force continued to be modernized with the vast variety of military jets, including stealth jet fighters. Lee's work report also said our national defense mobilization capability was boosted with the efforts we fully safeguarded China's sovereignty, security, and development interests. They stepped up military training, increased combat preparedness, and became a much more modernized and capable fighting force, it said. China's armed forces, with the focus on the goals for the centenary of the PLA in 2027, should work to carry out military operations, boost combat preparedness, and enhance military capabilities so as to accomplish the tasks entrusted to them by the CPC and the people, Lee said. The armed forces should intensify military training and preparedness. These intensifications should be across the board. They should develop new military strategic guidance, devote greater energy to training under combat conditions, and make well-coordinated efforts to strengthen military work in all directions and domains, Lee said. Ahead of the NPC session, its spokesman Wang Chao on Saturday defended China's steady increases in annual defense budgets, saying that the country's defense spending as a share of the GDP was lower than the world average. China's been ramping up its defense expenditure, and it's vying with the U.S. for global influence. Wang said the increase on the defense budget is needed to meet the complex security challenges for China to fulfill its responsibilities as a major country. China's military modernization will not be a threat to any country, but a positive force safeguarding regional stability and world peace, he said. And from MinaFN.com, China intends to increase its defense budget by 7.2% this year to 1.553 trillion won, $224.85 billion, according to a government report released on Sunday at the opening of the first session of the 14th National People's Congress, the supreme legislative body. Other news reports citing TASS. National defense spending is 1.553 trillion won this year, with the 7.2% increase, the document said. On the eve, Wang Chao, spokesman for the first session of the 14th National People's Congress, said that the increase in China's defense budget is dictated by the need to respond to complex security challenges as well as the need to fulfill the obligations of a major power. In 2022, China increased defense spending by 7.1%, and in 2021 by 6.8%. Many internal organizations, including the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, the SIPRI, believe that China significantly understands the official data on the military budget, while its actual value may be 25 to 50% higher. According to the analysts, the published data do not include several very important items: expenditures on strategic forces, defense research and development, import of foreign weapons, people's armed polices, and other paramilitary units. Also, provincial government spending on military expenditures is not included. Wow, yeah, and that's one of the questions that I had, was that, like, where's the delineation between what is military spending and what is non-military spending? You know, a lot of the times the United States will claim that their military pursuances outside of the U.S. are for humanitarian aid. So, I mean, technically, if they saw fit, they could count that in a budget other than a military budget. So that is really interesting. China would be, you know, one of those number counters that would do something like that, and just to make their military budget seem a bit smaller. Very interesting. And from the Daily Sabah, China plans to increase its military spending by 7.2%. The uptick in defense spending is proportionately higher than the planned increase in total expenditure. Uncertainties are on the rise in the external environment. Outgoing Chinese Premier Li Keqiang told the almost 3,000 delegates in the Great Hall of the People he called for the expansion of the country's armed forces, which should boost combat preparedness. This should also boost, other than boost combat preparedness, it should also enhance military capabilities so as to accomplish the tasks entrusted to them by the party and the people. A spokesperson for the meeting a day earlier had justified the above-average increase with complex security challenges and China's responsibilities as a great power. Observers have expressed concern at China's growing military might, considering Beijing's threatening posture toward Taiwan. Its contested claims in the South China Sea and its growing rivalry with the United States. China's defense budget has repeatedly risen faster than total spending in recent years. Last year, the military budget increased by 7.1%. The focus of the annual week-long meeting of hand-picked delegates is the approval of the planned formation of new government and the setting of the country's economic and political course. China's economic course is expected to increase around 5%, Lee said, as he opened this year's session. Following the end of the strict zero-COVID strategy, which had weighed heavily on the world's second-largest economy, last year, Lee said, he expects China to recover significantly. Last year, the growth rate was around 5.5%. And from C.News, SEE.news, the $224 billion increase in military spending seen by China's neighbors and in Washington as a barometer of how aggressively the country will beef up its military. The hike marks the 8th consecutive single-digit increase. It comes at a time when Beijing's nervous about challenges on fronts ranging from Taiwan to the U.S. naval and air missions in the disputed South China Sea near Chinese-occupied lands. In his work report to the annual session of Parliament, Lee said, military operations, capacity building, and combat preparedness should be well coordinated in fulfilling major tasks. Our armed forces, with the focus on the goals for the centenary of the People's Liberation Army in 2027, should work to carry out military operations, boost combat preparedness, and enhance military capabilities, he said in the State of the Nation address to the largely rubber-stamped legislature. Holding the world's largest military in terms of personnel, China is also adding a slew of new hardware, including aircrafts and stealth fighters. And here we have from Press TV a bit on China.
And welcome to Press TV Spotlight. I'm Marzia Hashimi. Thanks so much for being with us. One of the news items making the headlines of Western mainstream media outlets is that China is increasing its military budget by 7.2%. What these corporate-owned stations fail to report is that even with this increase in its defense budget, China is still spending just over 1/4 of what the United States spends. China has the second largest defense budget in the world after the U.S. Meanwhile, Washington is warning Beijing about supporting Russia in its war against Ukraine. China's foreign minister has responded by saying it's plain for the world to see who is calling for dialogue and striving for peace and who is adding fuel to the fire, handing out knives and instigating hostility. How dangerous is this scenario? Well, stay with us to find out all of this on this Spotlight. I'd like to welcome my guests to the program. William Jones from Executive Intelligence Review out of Washington, D.C. And John Ross, Senior Fellow, Changyang Institute for Financial Studies out of London. Thank you both for being with us. Well, let's start it off with William in Washington, D.C. Now, China has said that the reason it's increasing its defense budget is because of the escalating threats from abroad. Your assessment of this reason, is that true? And what does it all mean, really, in this this race for this military increase globally?
Well, I think it's absolutely the case. If you look at what the United States has been doing in its provocation, trying to create new alliances
partially of a military character in the Asia Pacific with Japan and Australia, continual and increased incursions into Taiwan Straits and the South China Sea, making a lot of trouble for China in that region. And also the general attempt to strangle China technologically by all the restrictions that are put on high technology products like semiconductors. This is a very hostile policy being imposed by the biggest military power in the world, which has a group of alliances in the so-called Western alliance system that they has brought to bear in terms of putting pressure on China. So obviously, China, which is concerned for its own defense of its own borders, of its own region, has increased its defense budget. It's not as dramatic as the United States. The United States increase in its defense budget, I believe, was 13% as compared to the 7% of the Chinese budget. But of course, the United States is involved in a major war in Europe. China is just trying to defend itself. So that puts that in a much different context. But there is concern because the world situation is very turbulent and very uncertain. This has been made very clear by the Chinese president. And they're kind of, what I say, girding their loins. If any trouble would come, they would be prepared to meet that.
Well, because it's losing in peaceful economic competition. The United States claims its economy is dynamic, etc., but the real reality is that it's losing in the competition to China. I mean, if we take the situation in the pandemic, since the beginning of the pandemic, in the 3 years of the pandemic, China's economy grew 2.5 times as fast as the United States. China grew over 13%, the US just over 5%. If you take the addition to world GDP in this period, it's 36% to China and about 16% to the United States. Then if you look at the individual companies, the US can't compete in telecommunications with Huawei. TikTok has become the most popular, so therefore the US is trying to ban Huawei. TikTok has become the most visited website in the world, so the US is now considering banning TikTok. Hikvision is the best producer of cameras for surveillance, etc. I mean, for safety surveillance in the world. So the US can't compete with that. The US admits that the whole solar power industry is totally dominated by China. The US is losing in peaceful economic competition. The only place in which it maintains a lead is military, because it's spending more together, so therefore increasingly tends to try to put things on a military terrain. And this is very, very dangerous, because the world wants to get on with peaceful development, but the US wants to move things more and more towards military actions.
Well, William, you just heard what John said. So, I mean, if it's the case that the United States cannot compete, but what they can compete in is with their military, I mean, why wouldn't Washington change its focus? I mean, it was once actually a technologically advanced country. It was the main producer of goods at one point in a time in the world. So wouldn't it make sense for the United States to actually reinvest in the country to actually get it to be more competitive technologically instead of war? I mean, how do you see it?
Well, this would be the rational response to that. The United States, of course, through its own fault, through decisions that have been made over the past decades, has transformed itself from a major industrial power to what I would call a rentier power. They have
Let's try and unpack that for a second. Let's try and de-emotionalize this for a second. Let's try and intellectualize this for a second. Let's try and rationalize this for a second.
Power of the dollar. So instead of producing steel or other products in Pennsylvania, they shut that down and moved to cheap labor countries that can produce it more cheaply. And this has led to really the deindustrialization of the United States. And if you look at our infrastructure, not to speak of the most dramatic example of our infrastructure was the explosion, the train derailment in Ohio, is an indication of where the United States stands. So everybody is aware of the fact that the U.S. economy has really moved not only in comparison to China, but in comparison to what it once was, from a major power to a economically to a really a second-rate power. And there is an understanding that there should be this infrastructure development, but it's happening in the context of this competition with China, which is making it impossible for them politically to get people together to move toward a program of a revitalization of the U.S. economy, which would create a little more confidence and a little less warlike bearing on the part of our politicians, who, as John Ross indicated, are really frightened that they've become a secondary power. But the United States policymakers are not thinking rationally in this respect. They had an opportunity also, even with China's Belt and Road initiative, that was also offered to the United States. They were prepared to help build high-speed rail in the U.S., and that was rejected because it was China doing it and not the United States doing. So it's their own folly which has led them to a policy which is restrictive, is punitive, and could lead to war, rather than a policy of trying to rebuild the economic potential of the United States. And that's put the world in a real dilemma at this point.
And we'll be back with more world news. And from Eurasia.net, days after talks, first high-profile talks, that is, a deadly clash in Karabakh. 5 were killed in the shootout, which occurred 4 days after the most public meeting yet between Azerbaijani and Karabakhi Armenian representatives. A shooting incident in Nagorno-Karabakh on March 5th left 3 Karabakhi Armenian police officers and 2 Azerbaijani soldiers dead. Naturally, Azerbaijani on the one hand and Karabakh and Armenia on the other are offering vastly different accounts of what happened. The incident comes just as Azerbaijan-Karabakh talks seem to be picking up steam, and nearly 3 months into the blockade of Karabakh by Azerbaijani government-sponsored activists. Those activists are camped out near the town of Shusha on the road that forms the Lachen corridor, Karabakh's only lifeline to Armenia and the outside world. The Azerbaijani Defense Ministry's account of the incident suggested that Armenian vehicles were attempting to bypass the blockade, which Baku denies is a blockade, in order to transport military equipment, ammunition, and personnel from Armenia to Karabakh. Azerbaijani army units had attempted to stop and inspect some such vehicles which had been using the Kankandi-Kalfali Tershu dirt road, it said. Kankandi is the Azerbaijani name for Stepanakert, the administrative center of Nagorno-Karabakh. The opposing side opened fire, and there were casualties and injuries from both sides as a result of the firefight, it added. Hold on, the opposing side? Is the opposing side the Azerbaijani side, or is the opposing side the Armenian side? The ministry said that the only road that can be used between Armenia and Karabakh is the Kankandi-Lachen road, and that the use of the detour constitutes a violation of the November 9, 2020 Russian brokered peace agreement between Armenia and Azerbaijan. I see. So there was a non-sanctioned or a non-permissible road being used by Armenians, and Azerbaijanis reacted. It called on the Russian peacekeeping contingent deployed in the area under the same agreement to intervene. Karabakh's de facto foreign ministry, meanwhile, said a group of saboteurs from the Azerbaijani armed forces crossed into Karabakh-administered territory and committed an armed attack on a patrol car of the passport and visa directorate of the Karabakh police, killing 3 officers and wounding another. And notice it says they said that. That means that's not necessarily what happened, you know. A reporter would report what happened, not what was said to have happened, right? Well, I mean, you could report both, but you would have to designate that something was said and not necessarily the occurrence itself, which is what this person did, which is, that's legitimate journalism. This incursion represents a violation of the trilateral agreement, it said. Armenia's foreign ministry supported that version, adding that the political vehicle that was attacked was on its way from Stepanakert to villages inside Nagorno-Karabakh, and that there was nothing in it besides documents and a service pistol. It dismissed as absurd Baku's accusation of personnel and weapons being transported from Armenia to Karabakh. Azerbaijan has long made such claims, including that Armenian and Karabakhi forces have continued to lay mines since the 2020 war that ended in Azerbaijan's victory. The International Court of Justice, the top court of the United Nations, ruled on February 23rd that Azerbaijan should ensure movement on the blockaded Lachen corridor. In its ruling, it rejected Azerbaijan's request that the court demand new measures related to allegations that Armenian forces are continuing to plant landmines on Azerbaijani territory. A day before the clash, Azerbaijani media reported that Azerbaijani soldiers had been killed when a mine planted by Armenians blew up the location of that incident. That was not reported. Azerbaijani's defense ministry said the March 5th incident demonstrates the need for establishing Azerbaijani checkpoints on the Lachen corridor. This demand was issued recently by President Ilham Aliyev in parallel with moving back from Baku's demand for the establishment of a seamless transportation link from mainland Azerbaijan to the Nakhchivan exclave through Armenia, known as the Zangezur corridor. Karabakh's foreign ministry said that the timing of the attack, 40 days after the most public yet meeting between Azerbaijani and Karabakhi representatives, indicates that there was no point in negotiations. Through its actions, Baku is openly demonstrating its rejection of talks as a means for resolving any issues, it said. And we could also say that, you know, Armenia, for using that road as opposed to the Lachen corridor, their actions were unjustified or a sign that negotiations were not working as well. Almayadeen.net. Armenia accuses Baku of terrorism after shootout, which claimed 3 lives. In a statement published on Sunday, the Armenian Foreign Ministry described Azerbaijan's actions as terrorism following a shootout in the Nagorno-Karabakh region, which claimed the lives of 3 Armenian police officers. Early today, a shootout broke out between the security forces of both countries. Azerbaijan's foreign ministry said that the shootout occurred when soldiers went to inspect vehicles that were suspected of transporting arms along an auxiliary dirt road, adding that several people were killed from both sides, but did not specify the exact number of losses. On March 5th, a unit of the Azerbaijani army was deployed to an area around the Kankindi-Kalfali-Tershu country road to check reports that the Armenian army is transporting weapons, munitions, and manpower. During the attempt to check a vehicle, the other side opened fire. The Azerbaijani army sustained losses, with several soldiers killed and wounded. So this one says the other side opened fire while they were checking the vehicle, so it makes it seem as though the Armenians opened fire here. The attacks were repelled by retaliatory fire, Azerbaijani's foreign ministry said. Yeah, so Azerbaijan says the Armenians fired first. Such acts of aggression and provocations demonstrate that Armenia has now dropped its occupational policy toward Azerbaijan, that Yerevan's ideas about the peaceful agenda is nothing but hypocrisy. Armenia is not interested in establishing peace and security in the region, it added. Armenia, on the other hand, said that the shootout was a staged provocation and that Baku fabricated false information on Yerevan's alleged transfer of weapons to the conflict zone. The official version of events put forward by Azerbaijan is absurd. They've not presented and cannot present any fact and justification supporting that version, quote unquote. The actions of, the actions of the Azerbaijani forces cannot be described as anything other than terrorism, unquote. The statement issued by the Armenian Foreign Ministry reads, And it also calls on organizations that are interested in the establishment of real peace to strongly condemn the U.S. force and the use of force and the threat of force by Azerbaijan, as well as another manifestation of provoking large-scale hostilities. It's also called for active steps to prevent further violations of Azerbaijan's own international obligations. And from TurkiyaNewspaper.com, clashes broke out between Armenia and Azerbaijan. 2 martyrs, 3 dead. Tensions arose again between Azerbaijan and Armenia. The Armenians, who made illegal military shipments to the lands under the control of the Russian peacekeepers in Karabakh, clashed with the Azerbaijani soldiers. In the statement made by the Ministry of Defense of Azerbaijan, it was reported that 2 soldiers were martyred. The second Nagorno-Karabakh between Azerbaijan and Armenia, which took place in 2020 and lasted 44 days. The Nagorno-Karabakh war ended in ceasefire brokered by Russia. However, the tension between the 2 countries escalates from time to time. So did it today. Armenians wearing weapons transformed from Azerbaijani army. The Ministry of Defense for Azerbaijan announced that 2 soldiers from the Azerbaijan army were martyred as a result of the fire opened by the Armenian forces in Karabakh. In the statement made by the ministry, the following was noted. Information was received that the military equipment, ammunition, and personnel were transported from Armenia to the territories of Azerbaijan, where Russian elements are temporarily deployed and where the Armenian population lives using the Hankendi-Halfeli-Tersu road. Our soldiers then took action. In the morning hours, the suspect vehicle was requested to be stopped for control purposes, but the occupants of the vehicle opened fire. As a result of the provocation of the illegal Armenian forces in Karabakh, soldiers named Shahryar Alibeyli and Eskin Husseinov were martyred. There were reports that 3 Armenian police officers died in the clash as well. And remember, your engagement by way of a like, share, and or subscribe will propel us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before.
is obvious to the most simple-minded that Lokai is of an inferior breed.
The obvious visual evidence, Commissioner, is that he is of the same breed as yourself.
Are you blind, Commander Spock? Oh, look at me.
I thought you scientists were supposed to keep an open mind.
There's a difference between keeping an open mind and believing something because you want it to be true.
Your friend Spock is a logical man.
I find your arguments strewn with gaping defects in logic.
Most illogical reaction. We demonstrated our superior weapons. They should have fled.
You mean they should have respected us?
Of course.
Mr. Spock, respect is a rational process. Did it ever occur to you they might react emotionally? With anger?
Doctor, I'm not responsible for their unpredictability.
You do not think like the others. There are no colors to your patterns of logic. There's only black and white.
Logical, unemotional, completely pragmatic. And we poor, irrational humans whip them in a fair fight. Now you'll find yourself back among us illogical humans again.
Which I find eminently satisfactory, Doctor. For nowhere am I so desperately needed.
Because she feels. I don't. All I know is logic.
Will you try to understand how we feel about our life here? About each other?
Emotions are alien to me. I'm a scientist.
You're gonna leave here without them? Run off on some wild goose chase halfway across the galaxy just because you found a discrepancy in a hydrogen cloud?
Doctor, I am chasing the captain, Lieutenant Uhura, and Ensign Chekhov, not some wild aquatic fowl.
Mr. Spock, you have a remarkably logical and analytical mind.
Thank you. I prefer the concrete, the graspable, the provable.
You'd make a splendid computer, Mr. Spock.
And from Memo, Middle East Monitor, Israel to impose West Bank Gaza crossing closures during Jewish holiday. Israel occupation forces announced yesterday that no crossings or checkpoints will operate from today until Wednesday, leaving the occupied West Bank and Gaza Strip cut off. The decision comes as Israel prepares to mark the Jewish holiday of Purim tomorrow and Wednesday. The closures are standard practice during the Jewish national holiday of Purim, which the military claims is a preventative measure. Exceptions will be made for humanitarian and other outstanding cases. Still, they will require the approval of the coordinator of government activities in these territories, the occupation force in charge of Palestinian affairs in the occupied territories. According to the Times of Israel, the occupation said the border crossings for Palestinians were to reopen on Thursday, subject to a situational assessment. The Israeli measures include the closure of all major roads, setting up military checkpoints, and the intensification of the army's presence, as well as the closure of all crossings around the Gaza Strip, tightening the siege even further. All such abusive and oppressive actions against Palestinians are said to be needed as a means of securing the celebrations of the settlers. Last year was the first year in 5 years in which a closure was not imposed on the occupied West Bank. These closures further damage and limit the growth of the Palestinian economy. Purim is celebrated every year on the 14th of the Hebrew month of Adar, which generally falls in late winter or early spring. Huawei rampage, more overhaul prompted by way of insubordination threat. Prescient. This is from the Times of Israel. Prescient. That's perhaps the word that best describes the letter the commander of the Israeli Air Force sent to his subordinates on Friday, demanding that they continue to report for duty and making it clear that the military would continue to operate according to well-established moral standards. A day earlier, Major General Tomer Bar had spoken with the Air Force's senior brass, both career and reserve officers, and first realized the extent of the crisis. During that conversation, it was mostly the reservists who spoke out, among them pilots and EIAI, who expressed fear that the government's radical judicial overhaul plans could expose them to arrest in various international airports and prosecution by global forums such as the International Criminal Court. Israel has long argued against such probes, pointing to the strength and independence of its own judiciary, which is responsible for investigating the incidents of wrongdoing by Israeli forces. Critics of the government's legal overhaul warn that efforts to restrict the High Court of Justice's power will rob the country of legitimacy in the international arena. But for the pilots, even more than the legal concerns that they specified in their letter, the crisis centered on Huwara, the Palestinian town where settler vigilantes rampaged last week, torching homes and cars and wounding dozens of residents. One Palestinian was shot dead in unclear circumstances. The Huwara incident crossed a dangerous line. One of the senior fighter pilots who participated in the conversation told the Times of Israel, "We didn't hear unequivocal wall-to-wall condemnation of the lynching of Palestinian civilians by Jewish hoodlums," said the officer, a reservist brigadier general who used to command one of the IAF's largest bases. Instead, he continued, "We heard support for these actions from Knesset members, equivocation from ministers, and mealy-mouthed condemnations from large swaths of the hard right. And then to cap it off, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich came along on Wednesday with his blunt statement calling for Huwara to be wiped out." "We who attack enemy targets at the behest of political leaders have never heard of an order to wipe out a village," added the officer, whose name cannot be published due to the sensitivity of his position. "In the past, we never doubted the righteousness of the path and the morality of decisions. Today, there are questions And today, there are question marks regarding the moral fiber of some of the decision makers. That's why we're issuing this warning." Confronted with such statements during his meeting with the senior pilots, Barr, the AIF chief, realized he had to act fast and put out the flames before they spread and gave rise to widespread insubordination. In the letter that he penned to reservist air crews immediately after the meeting, one line stood out as a direct response to the concerns regarding the Huwara rampage. "I will state the obvious. The Zionist occupying forces, including the IAF, conducts itself according to the codified operational practice and the moral standards, values, and spirit of the IDF, and will continue to do so. I will insist on it no matter what, as always," he wrote. In other words, Barr told his pilots, "Not on my watch. I'm the moral buttress protecting you from any immoral command." What he did not state, but was apparent between the lines, was a commitment to say no to political leaders should the need arise. For the pilots of the 69th Squadron, the IAF strategic unit, which bombed Syria's nuclear reactor in 2007 and would likely lead the charge in any future Israeli attack on Iran, it was too little too late. On Sunday, 37 of the squadron's 40 pilots announced in a letter that they would not show up in the training session on Wednesday, in protest of the government's plan to radically curtail the judiciary. The Air Force is unsure how to respond to the letter, which places the military in the middle of a socio-political battleground that it desperately sought to avoid. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant has in recent weeks been trying to steer the military establishment between two political landmines. Finance Minister Smotrich and his far-right ally Itamar Ben-Gvir, the National Security Minister, on Sunday. Gallant joined Benny Gantz and Gadi Eisenkot, two former chiefs of staff currently with the opposition National Unity Party, in calling for dialogue and for the IDF to stay out of the fray. That, too, may not be enough, with additional reserve pilots already gearing up to join the protest of their comrades in the 69th Squadron. Though the IAF is hoping that the protests will end this week and the pilots will show up for duty, the military is beginning to understand that their actions only a symptom pointing to a more severe condition. The Air Force is where the crisis first manifested merely due to the fact that pilots have to show up for weekly practice flights and fitness tests, not because pilots are inherently more politically conscious than other reservists. No one in the military is under the illusion that the reservists in the ground forces will not launch similar protests in similar numbers, though they're due to the extent of their service a few weeks every year. The magnitude will not be apparent until the end of the year. For the time being, there are reports of silent protests, not as organized as the one launched by the pilots. It is instructive that Huwara rampage is proving to be a watershed for the military, both standing army and the reserves. Chief of Staff Hersi Halevi made it clear that he sees the incident as an ethical bellwether, an operational failure with a moral implication. Halevi staked out that territory in a speech last week to graduating Navy officers. I would say that that's true, but I would also say that, let's put it in the context of Jenin as well and make sure that Huwara isn't used as a cover to exploit Jenin, that they both should be closely monitored. We also had to prevent what developed in the wake of the initial attack in Huwara, he said, referring to the terrorist shooting that killed 2 Israeli brothers. See, that's what I was saying. Just right before I read, I didn't know it was there, but this idea that the 2 Israeli brothers are at the beginning of, all of the conflicts between these people, when in reality you have occupiers being the issue, Zionist apartheid occupiers that need to be removed. Halevi is not a man of many words. Trained as a philosopher, he knows how to keep his message concise. The fact that he chose to address the Huwara incident in such a manner, disregarding the diplomatic fallout, for instance, Smotrich's comments and the American response to them, is a clear indication that he has no intention of letting it slide. The head of the IDF Central Command, Major General Yehuda Fox, who is in charge of troops of the West Bank, said last week that the vigilante settlers had carried out a pogrom in Huwara. Later this week, he's set to present Halevi with the results of an IDF investigation into the incident. Fox has already admitted that the military was caught unprepared, so there are likely to be several repercussions along the chain of command.
Your inconsistencies are glaringly obvious.
That entire paragraph is a cope. It's a full-on cope. This idea that they weren't prepared, and we've seen in multiple, and just in the past few weeks, and I'm sure it happens quite often, we've seen multiple occasions where the Zionist occupying forces disallow ambulances and other caretakers to be on the scene to help those injured. So this is all a cope. And the head of the IDF Central Command, that we just read that. And it seems that at least as far as the IDF is concerned, the Huwara rampage, beyond being the result of extremist ideology among some in the settler movement, is a symptom of broader, more dangerous moral lapse. I don't think it's from extremist ideology. And remember, that was from the Times of Israel. It's not really a impartial paper. Palestinian authorities scurries to stop new West Bank resistance faction, a report. Support for the PA has plummeted as a result of its collaboration with the Israeli army to persecute and apprehend resistance fighters and critics. Palestinian Authority forces are working to prevent a new Palestinian resistance faction from gaining a foothold in the northern West Bank city of Tulkarm, according to a PA official who spoke with the Jerusalem Post. The Tulkarm Brigade army known in late February following an Israeli army raid in the city of Nablus, during which 11 Palestinians were massacred. After Tulkarm's accession to the armed resistance and the completion of the formation of its cells, the resistance in the West Bank now has a shield and a sword, the newly formed group said in a statement last month. Since then, the Tulkarm Brigade has claimed responsibility for at least 3 shooting attacks targeting Avnei Hafetz, an illegal settlement located in southeast Tulkarm, and the Zimmer military gate, which connects the area to Israel. We don't follow foreign agendas, and our decision is unanimous to fight against the occupiers with all the means at our disposal, and the path we've chosen is armed struggle, a source close to the Tulkarm Brigade told Al-Arabi Al-Jadid. In the face of this new threat, the PA has moved quickly to oppose the new resistance group, raiding the home of a suspected leader of the group and arresting 3 other suspects over the past week. We will not tolerate scenes of anarchy and lawlessness in Tulkarm, the PA official stressed. Anyone who breaks the law or threatens the residents and the Palestinian security forces will be arrested and punished. The PA has long maintained deep security ties with the Israeli army to suppress resistance in the West Bank. Their collaboration with the apartheid government has led to plummeting support by citizens across the occupied territories. PA forces have conducted raids in Tulkarm and 2 adjacent refugee camps over recent days, rounding up dozens of citizens who took to the streets supporting the Tolkar Brigade. Instead of defending the people against the crimes of the Israeli army, our leaders in Ramallah are sending the Palestinian security forces to arrest the young men who want to defend us. We believe the Palestinian Authority reached secret understandings with Israel and the U.S. at the recent summit in Aqaba. There's a conspiracy against all the armed factions in the West Bank, and we shouldn't allow it to pass, Yusuf Ismail, a Fatah activist from Tulkarm, recently told reporters. So I'm going to open a channel here. And remember, your engagement through a like, a share, and or subscribe will propel us, accelerate us at warp speed towards the continuation of our mission to truthfully go where no news will have been going before. Beam me up.
Beam me up, Mr. Spock. Beam me up. Lock on transporters. Beam us up. Beam us up. Quickly. Beam us up home. Beam us up.
Prepare to beam us up, Mr. Scott. Beam us up, Mr. Scott.
Prepare to beam us up. Mr. Scott, prepare to beam us up. Have Scotty beam us up. Beam us up. Beam us up. Scotty, beam us up fast. Stand by to beam us up. Scotty, beam me up.
Beam me up.
Beam us up now!
Stand by to beam us up.
No need to beam me up, sir. The situation is under control.